In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Back in June, after an Advent Cafe service, Martha took me aside and told me she was having another sermon series entitled Images of God, and would really like me to consider doing one of these sermons. I almost immediately said yes. And do you know why I said yes? In that moment, I wanted to shock her. And I did. And then I had to get in the car and come home, and I believe I said to David, "What have I done?" So partially, just partially, because of my cockiness that time, I stand before you this evening. 36 years ago, my daughter Devon and I were driving in the car. All was quiet when a voice from the back seat yelled, "Mummy, look, there's God." Like all good mothers should, I searched the sidewalk for an older man, perhaps with a white beard, but there was absolutely no one around. Once again I heard, "Mummy, look, there's God." When I let her know that I just couldn't see who she was looking at, she leaned forward as far as she could and stretched out her arm and pointed her finger in the direction of the windshield. Well, in front of me was one of the most beautiful sights I have ever seen. There was a semicircle, a large semicircle of the beautiful rays of the sun coming down through the clouds to the earth. And my 3-year-old saw God in that image. To this day, whenever I see that sight, I say either to myself or out loud, "Look, there's God." And it serves to remind me that God is there, all around us, watching out for us. I have always felt that even though my faith is very real and very important to me, that somehow God eluded me in the way He seems to speak to others around me. I have what I feel is a very simple faith, strong, but simple, ordinary. Sometimes I wonder why God isn't speaking to me. Why don't I hear God in that special way, or have a feeling come over me that God would like me to move in one direction or another? Why don't I feel that? I hear others comment around me that God spoke to them, or God wanted them to do one thing or another. At the time, I just didn't feel those personal communications with God. What was I doing wrong? I must admit, there were times I felt a little jealous. I have always realized that I am most aware of God in nature. In a beautiful night sky full of millions of stars, or a tranquil lake with tall trees around it. But I learned recently that God can be seen and felt and heard in small things we can hold in our hand. This past year, I participated in the Revive program at the church. One evening, we had a task to perform. We were learning about a particular type of prayer called Visio Divina. This type of prayer involves looking at an object or a piece of art along with your personal prayer. There was a table set up in the church sanctuary with many different objects on it. We were all to choose one. Most of them were quite ornate for me, but my eyes went straight to a small wooden cross that was really quite plain, quite simple. This cross. I later learned that it had been loaned to us by Reverend Scott for the evening, and he graciously loaned it to me again. After finding a quiet place in the church, we were to go through the steps we learned for this prayer, listening for God speaking to us through this image or object we were holding in our hand. In all honesty, I was quite sure I wouldn't feel anything or be on the receiving end in any way. After all, God doesn't communicate with me. As I sat in the quiet, looking at this cross in my hand, I first thought about the man who had made it. He had carved such a simple wooden cross, and yet so beautiful, so lovely. What talent he had. I continued to look at the cross in my hand, and a few moments later, I sat bolt upright and said out loud, "Oh!" I'm sure disturbing absolutely everybody around me. Because suddenly I knew it was a feeling, an all-over feeling. I knew that God was sending me a message, that just like this simple cross, my simple, ordinary faith was just fine. It was okay. I was really elated for the rest of the evening. I really thought for me that this was a first. The message that God sent me is very similar to the one that we heard in our reading this evening. Paul was trying to teach the power of the gospel and convey the message of the cross to the people of Corinth. A simple message of God's power and love and hope. Well, the Greeks were in love with philosophy, and all they would do was analyze the information with great wisdom. They needed it to sound very, very wise, very elite. But unfortunately, in their words, they most often found it foolish. And the Jews, well, they were constantly looking for signs or miracles to prove that this man, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross, really was the Son of God. They couldn't believe that a true Messiah would die. They thought he would go on forever. And he certainly wouldn't die in a way that was most often used for common criminals. I can't imagine Paul's frustration at this time. But I believe that through Paul, God was saying to each and every one of us that you don't need to use incredible intellect or hear bells or other signs and whistles in the sky to understand and accept the message of the cross. That is what faith is, pure and simple. It is using your mind, but it's also using your heart. It is quite simply believing. And the most important thing of all is that the message of the cross is available to everyone from all walks of life, no matter what. After all, the simplicity of a wooden cross was enough to connect me with God. Amen.
Amen.